And to talk more on the George Floyd protests in the United States and around the world, I'm now joined via Skype from San Francisco in the United States by Black Lives Matter activist Shahid Buttar. Well, Shahid is also running for Congress and is challenging House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, who hasn't faced a Democratic opponent in 30 years. Shahid, a very good evening to you. Thanks for joining us. Welcome to the Globe.
Thanks so much for having me.
Okay, take us through the significance of the Black Lives Matter movement and, just why is it relevant now?
So the movement for Black Lives aims to vindicate basic human rights, principles like the presumption of innocence, principles like due process, principles on which liberty, frankly, is fundamentally grounded. And I would describe the significance of the movement for Black Lives as not only rooted in vindicating the civil rights movement, and the parts of our nation's history of which we're most proud, but it also relates, frankly, to vindicating our democracy. We are living in the United States this week through an authoritarian crackdown, and we are witnessing fascism emerge under our feet. We have a criminal president using armed agents of the state to suppress dissent, and we might be in the streets originally because armed agents of the state are killing Black people, and that is a problem with respect to racial justice and police accountability. It's also, though, and particularly in the context of the government response to our democratic mobilizations, we are witnessing basically a democratization struggle to make sure that we have a free country and not one where our dissent is circumscribed and militarily controlled, limited by the state.
All right, perhaps we should extend our analysis as to what is it really caused this movement to gain momentum. I mean, the world has never been this united over the death of a single Black man. What could have necessitated the momentum to increase at the rate that it has?
One of them is just the sheer audacity of the incident itself. I mean, the murder of George Floyd is so particularly brutal. And it reflects the banality of evil because it was brutal by an act effectively of omission. The officer's on his neck. All he had to do was stand up or listen or demonstrate even a modicum of humanity, or for anyone around him, his fellow officers perhaps, to abide their training standards, right? It was the failure of even the most basic standards of human decency and the willingness to casually murder someone on tape. And we've seen this before, frankly. Eric Garner's death also in New York City, and this would have been 2013, maybe 2014, also sparked similar outrage. And the reason we're in the streets today is because Emmett Till in the United States in the 60s prompted similar outrage. We've seen too many of these incidents, and the problem is precisely that our policies have never responded to take account of the popular outrage, to vindicate the rule of law, and restore due process. A lot of people in the United States are under the impression that we have certain rights, and we do on paper. And the question is, do we in fact? And African Americans in the United States, frankly, have never had equal rights at any point in our nation's history. And this movement is about making sure that we finally honor those promises. And I think that Americans generally feel a sense of authoritarian crisis already, just vis-a-vis our criminal president, setting aside even the movement. And so that also primed the moment, I think, the combination of the brutality of George Floyd's particular murder, the inaction and unresponsiveness of our political institutions, and the growing sense of alarm across the United States that our democracy is very, very much at risk, I think are all combining to fuel and amplify and drive the protests that we've seen this week.
And having said that, what would you like to see happen in terms of sustaining this momentum?
The keys here relate first to putting in place limits on police so that dissent is a safe option for people to pursue. At the moment, police make it a matter, frankly, for some people of life and death. People have died this week, not just in response to police violence, but specifically in response to police violence suppressing dissent. That is a cornerstone, a defining cornerstone of authoritarianism. And I frankly hope that the rest of the world recognizes it as such. I think another step that needs to move forward is our communities building the resiliency to continue mobilizing. That includes mutual aid networks to do things like we have an organization here in the United States, the National Lawyers Guild, which has long been dedicated to ensuring that people participating in protests who are arrested have legal support through the process. There's any number of other kinds of support that people need, and our communities need to organize that support as a counterpoint to the state influence. Another piece here, and what I'm particularly interested in as a congressional candidate, is policies that respect and enshrine civil rights. So among those, I'd like to end qualified immunity. There was a bill introduced in Congress just this week to do that. I proposed that 2 years ago. I'd like to defund police departments that violate civil rights. And there's a proposed act in Congress, the End Racial Profiling Act, which Congress has never enacted, that should finally become law. Those are all points of distinction with the Speaker of the House, who's been unwilling to support civil rights despite the rhetoric of the Democratic Party. And I'm here, and the movement is here, to make those promises finally real.
You know, Shahid, we've seen some certain elements, and in some instances, criminal elements hijacking this movement. So will this not perhaps erode the very fabric of the essence of what the Black Lives Matter movement is all about?
Some people would suggest that, and I understand why police departments and businesses would draw attention to incidents of property destruction. But I want to distinguish very clearly violence, which involves hurting people, that's what police do, versus harms to property, which frankly pale in comparison. Every business that's been looted, you can restock a business. Even if a business gets burned, not that I'm condoning it, but you can rebuild it. You can't bring people back to life. What happened to George Floyd is incalculably worse than what happened to any business and what's happened to any police officer in the last week. And when I hear concerns about supposedly criminal elements taking over protests, I'm much more concerned with the criminal elements that seem to have taken over our police departments and the criminal elements that have escaped accountability, despite, as you noted, on more than one occasion, on more than dozens of occasions, on entirely too many occasions, killing innocent people with the resources that we as a society invest in our public servants to keep us safe. That, to me, is the profound irony. When people are worried about criminal elements and protesters, these are members of the public, outraged members of the public who are tired of being preyed upon. When we look at police murders, these are public servants who owe us a duty, people who we train and equip, who should be held to a higher standard. And so I hear implicit in the concern, and I've heard that from other people, just a misunderstanding about what we're dealing with here. These are not people, the folks who are looting stores, they're powerless people who are pushed to the brink. And the police who are murdering people in broad daylight, those are not powerless people. Those are powerful people in whom we've invested resources, and they should be held to the stronger standard.
Now, on a different matter, Shahid, I understand you're now running for office seeking to unseat Nancy Pelosi, who is ostensibly the most powerful Democrat in the United States. So, looking at the fact that you don't have much experience in public office, and Nancy Pelosi is the incumbent, in what way, what is it that you're bringing to the table to unseat her?
I appreciate that. 20 years of fighting for our rights. So I've had the opportunity over the last 20 years I was one of the first courtroom advocates advocating for the right of consenting adults to marry the partner of their choice. I was willing to defend gay rights when Speaker Pelosi was not. I've been in the streets organizing street demonstrations and policy advocacy struggles to defund and limit U.S. militarism abroad. She has been a proponent of U.S. resource extraction wars for profit and plunder that I aim to end. She's also been an architect of the mass surveillance state. I've spent over a decade fighting mass surveillance, not just in Washington, but at the local level in campaigns limiting police surveillance across the country. I think I might be the first congressional candidate in the history of the Republic who has both been invited on multiple occasions to brief members of the House and their aides on proposed reforms, and arrested in the U.S. Senate for an act of journalism. And my act of journalism and the arrest demonstrate, quite frankly, in similar terms, the kind of authoritarianism that we fear in the United States. What I experienced and what I experienced before that as an immigrant Muslim pale in comparison, frankly, to what African Americans have had to endure over the 400-year history of this country preceding our republic. But the common dimension of arbitrary, unaccountable power remains. And I'm very eager to democratize the United States. I'm a democratic socialist, so I'm committed both to defending human rights and to vindicating the principles of our democracy and stopping authoritarianism before it takes root.
All right, Shahid, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, good stuff. That was Black Lives Matter activist Shahid Buttar joining us via Skype.